Hello, it's Miss Chinnick. I am coming to you with some detailed information about your egg drop report, which will be your final exam and final assignment for this fall semester. It's nice to not have to sweat and stress over a final exam test, but the final exam is really in your hands since you are going to be building the apparatus for your egg and writing the report to explain everything that you've learned this semester. Instead of doing a final exam review where I review all of the information that you've covered, I'm going to just give a little chat about the topics that I want covered on your report. You will find all of the report information here in your egg drop project page, which is posted on Google Classroom and should be in your notebook. But I have 7 things here listed that I'd like you to take some time to write about in your report. And then after we are done on Thursday with the egg drop apparatus, you should be able to get a rough draft finished. And I have this note in red down here about the Google Doc. If you'll please draft your report in a Google Doc and then share it with me online, that would be fantastic. I will be happy to give you some comments. You just need to give me commenting ability. When you share it with me, you'll have a choice to give me editing ability or just viewing ability or comment. And editing or commenting should work great because then I can give you some pointers, tell you what you might have gotten confused about and what you might have left out so we can get you the biggest, fattest final grade possible. And this is 20% of your final grade, so I will hope that you take some time and put some effort into it. And let's get busy and talk about what you need to talk about in your report in your own words. So the first topic is kinematics, and that was the first thing we did this semester. We had a lesson on velocity and acceleration and what happens as things are falling due to the acceleration of gravity. So if I am hanging out up here at some height, either in the classroom or in the playground or at the parking deck this week, and I drop my egg apparatus or I drop your egg apparatus down to hit the ground, what is happening to the velocity as it's falling? So I want you to tell me, is the velocity changing? Or is the velocity constant? What happens as it falls through the air? What happens at the different heights? Is there going to be the same initial velocity? Is the final velocity right before it hits the ground the same for all 3 heights, or is it going to vary depending on the distance that it falls? I want you to talk about acceleration. Do we know what the acceleration is? Is it constant as the egg falls, or is it changing as the egg falls? And this might be a little bit of a weighted question depending on your apparatus and how you built it, because it is possible that we live on a planet where the gravity is our acceleration and it's a constant value, but it's possible that your acceleration for your particular apparatus is in fact changing due to forces that are at work on that apparatus. So these are the things that I want you to get into in detail. Every person's report is not going to look the same. There's not one right report. So I want you to talk about the velocity and how it's changing. Can we predict what its change would be every second? The acceleration, is it a constant value? Might your acceleration be changing? And then I would like you to discuss how the drop heights affect, either velocity or acceleration. That would be a great question to discuss in your report. Is it going to have a different velocity or a different acceleration at a different height? We've talked about all these in class. You've answered questions about them in your homework. You've got tests in front of you where I ask these same questions. So be sure to use all of those resources to help you answer these correctly. But that's one reason why I like to do the rough draft, so I can get a chance to glance at it and see if you've gotten everything right, hit everything and gotten it correct when you wrote about it. Some of the specifics that you can discuss in your particular report might have to do with parachutes. even if you choose not to use a parachute in the drop this week, what was your thinking there? Did you decide that it wasn't worth the effort? Did you try to do a parachute? If you tried to do a parachute, why were you compelled to do a parachute? What does a parachute do for you with regards to velocity and or acceleration? I would like you to talk about whether or not your apparatus has a large surface area. And we'll get into this a little bit more with the next topic, but that's a good thing to discuss with regards to velocity and acceleration. And there's a word I'd like to remind you of that we discussed, and we'll talk about it a little more in the next one when we do forces, and that's terminal velocity. So these are the things I'd like you to discuss in the section. This goes with number 1 on your, or number 2, excuse me, on the Egg Drop Project page, the kinematics of the falling apparatus. So these are the topics that I'd like you to cover. All right, on to the next topic. The next topic is forces. The forces that are acting on your egg apparatus as it falls. So I have a zoomed in picture here of, excuse me for jiggling that camera. I have a zoomed in picture of the egg drop apparatus up at a higher height in our fall. And the egg apparatus has mass. You know it has mass because I am going to be giving you that mass when you get to class. So because the apparatus has mass, and then of course the egg has mass, then we know that there's going to be a weight acting on our object. So when we drew free body diagrams back in the forces unit, we discussed how everything has mass on our planet, and therefore everything's going to have weight. So you can sketch this out in your report if you want to, or you can describe it in words. And if you were describing it in words because you just wanted to keep everything texty in your report, you could talk about how the weight of our apparatus and egg is acting downward. That is not something that changes or is different for each apparatus. We always know the weight is acting downward. It's pulling towards the center of the earth. And so that is a force that's acting on every person's egg drop apparatus. You could actually calculate that weight. So if you'll recall the formula for weight, which we called Fg, or sometimes Fw for weight, is equal to mass times gravity. So you can find that weight using the mass that I give you, and you can include the mass of the egg. We'll do that too, times gravity, which is 9.8 or 10 meters per second squared. So when you first drop the egg, it's not going very fast, and therefore there might not be any resistance forces acting on that egg when you first drop it. But once it's been falling for a little while and it's gained some speed, we might imagine that the egg still has the same weight. So you could mention that that weight is constant. So the weight is always acting downward and it's constant. But now we may have some resistance acting against our egg apparatus. And that is the part you can get into some more specifics about with your particular apparatus. So air resistance is going to act upward. When we have two forces acting in opposition, we can find the net force on those two. So the net force is going to be the weight minus the resistance. And we did this on that conceptual physics page where we had the guy jumping out with a parachute. He jumped out of a helicopter with a parachute. And we did a lot of calculations with these. We took weight minus resistance. And in that particular conceptual physics page, which you could go back and look at for a little help and guidance, we did multiple calculations, and we had to do that because the weight was always the same, but this air resistance was changing. So this particular value may be variable. And it depends on your apparatus and how you built it. If you built it so that it has a parachute, we talked about the drops in the classroom, they're smaller, are going to be more difficult because the parachute doesn't have time to open up and give you a lot of air resistance. But if you had something that was just catching the air, something with a large surface area like we discussed in the kinematic section, that would make this force larger, and that force might become large to the point where it balances out the weight, and then we have terminal velocity. So recall again, if the net force of a falling object is equal to 0, then we have reached terminal velocity. Now, if you tell me that your apparatus, which was built like a rock, maybe not a rock, but just a solid little chunky thing like this, and there was very little air resistance and no parachute going up from it, I'm not going to buy that it reached terminal velocity. I think you'll be able to see that too when we do the drop this week. I think you'll find that you can tell the ones that hit terminal velocity and the ones that don't hit terminal velocity. So you don't need to discuss this if your apparatus was not slowed down by air resistance. So I want you to talk about the forces acting on it. I want you to specifically discuss your apparatus and whether or not you were using the air resistance force to slow it down. And I'd like you to talk about whether that net force is changing as it falls or whether it's constant. We know the weight is constant and acting downward, but what's going on with this net force? That's where the excitement's happening. And you could mention Newton's second law, always a good idea. I'll slide this over a little bit. That weight minus resistance, that net force, is going to equal mass times acceleration, F equals ma. So that wouldn't be a bad idea to discuss as well. The net force on the object is going to affect its acceleration, which is why I talked about in the kinematic section that some of your apparatus that are built might end up having a variable acceleration. Our next topic is the one that we just finished recently, which is momentum and impulse. This is probably, in my opinion, the most important of all the topics that we discuss in this egg drop project, because it is very much affected by what you decide to do with your specific apparatus. At the very top, where I'm dangling out over the parking deck and preparing to drop the egg apparatus, what is the momentum of my apparatus as I'm holding it in my hands? Momentum is equal to mass times velocity, and if it's not moving, then the momentum before it's dropped is 0. And it's going to reach that 0 momentum again. So I want to focus more on this. You can discuss what's happening to the momentum of the object as it's falling if you'd like, but I really want you to focus on this part. And what most people do accidentally is they tell me that the momentum changes during the fall and that the impulse is going to do something to change that. That's kind of set in stone. That depends on everything we've already talked about. We talked about the net force on our apparatus, and we talked about the kinematics that result from that net force. That part is sort of set, but I want to get more into what happens from the right before the impact to after it impacts the ground. So once we fall this full distance and we get to our maximum velocity, whether that's low or high, depending on whether you have a parachute or whether you don't have a parachute, what you're going to find is that you have a maximum momentum right here as it's about to hit the ground, just before it hits the ground, because your velocity is a maximum. Right after it impacts the ground, it's not moving at all. So we are back to a momentum that is 0. So that maximum momentum to a momentum of 0 is what we refer to as the change in momentum. And that change occurs because the ground is going to apply an impulse to the apparatus to bring it to a stop. So our change in momentum is equal to the impulse from the ground. And those numbers are set by your particular apparatus and by the way you designed it to work. So I want to talk a little bit more about this specific change in momentum. This is going to depend on a couple things. It depends on the mass of your apparatus. So I would like you to talk about whether or not you built an apparatus that's heavy or whether you built one that's lighter. You will know because I'll mass everybody's in class, and I'll rank them up on the board from lightest to heaviest, and we'll see whose is the heaviest. If you built a super heavy apparatus because you used 2 pounds of tape, then you're going to have more momentum to change. Now, the mass part isn't going to change as much as the velocity, but it's going to have an effect in the overall change in momentum. It might end up making your egg safer because you have more padding, but it's something that you can discuss in your report. So it's going to depend on the change in momentum will depend on the mass, and it's also going to depend on your final velocity that you achieve. And this is where the parachute comes into play. If you have opted to use a parachute and you've kept your velocity very low right when it hits the ground, then your momentum, the maximum momentum, is not going to be very large. If you have not built a parachute and you just have a little boxy thing and it gains speed the whole way to the ground, your momentum may be much larger, especially if your mass is larger. So that change in momentum might be significant. So I would like you to discuss how your particular apparatus mass and final velocity are affecting what will happen at impact. How the way you built it will change that moment, how that will affect the change in momentum that it experiences when it hits the ground. Now let's discuss this impulse business, because that to me is the best part. Impulse, just to remind you, is FT. And we say that the impulse that the ground provides is equal to the mass times the change in velocity that your apparatus experiences. So this is what we were just talking about up here. Depends on the mass and the final velocity of your object, because we know that it's going to change momentum to 0. So the faster it's going, the bigger this side of the equation is. But this is a set number. It can't change based on your, how you drop it. It just changes based on your design and how fast you let the apparatus go and how heavy it is. This part then is also a set number, and there's a force in there, and this right here is the force that breaks the egg. But if you recall our discussion about impulse and momentum, that impact force can be changed even though this whole side over here is a set number. So let's expand on that just a little bit and be sure that we are clear on what part, of this impulse is the changeable part. So you have built your apparatus in such a way, probably with some squishy, fluffy stuff in here and your straws pointing just so, in order to change something in this equation. And that something would be the time of impact. You could have a very short time of impact, or you could have a very large time of impact. So if you have a short time of impact, then your force is going to have to be very large. And that is what is going to create yoke, spillage. If you have a very long time of impact, you're going to have a small impact force. Both of these, big F times little t and little f times big T, are going to result in the same impulse because that was yours from your set change in momentum. However, that big F and little f are what make the difference between a successful egg drop and an unsuccessful egg drop. This force is going to keep your egg safe, and this force is not. So that's the part I really want you to discuss, is how your time of impact affects the force of impact. And this time part right here is what you have done in your apparatus with squishy, cushiony, and soft things. Some of you have just reduced the momentum by putting a parachute on, but some of you have added extra paper towels and tissue paper, and some of you have built the straws out in such a way so that they bend or flex when they hit the ground and provide a longer time of impact. So that's an important part. All right, our last thing to discuss is energy. And energy was our last topic in this class, and I want to quickly go over how the energy changes. So this will be pretty fresh. I don't think I'll need to take too long to remind you about the energy changes. Let me flip over my sheet of notes. Okay. We've done a lot of these pictures over the last couple of weeks. What's going on here at the top? We have a lot of potential energy. In fact, our maximum potential energy is right up here at the top, and there's an equation that you can use to calculate that maximum potential energy. It is mgh. So that height is an important thing to discuss in your report. How does, y'all can hear my dog whining. She wishes she was on a walk right now. How does height affect the potential energy? Which of the drops has the highest potential energy? The one in the classroom, the one on the playground, or the one from the parking deck? So we have a maximum potential energy up here at the top, and then as this thing falls all the way down to the ground, that potential energy is going to decrease. And what's going to increase? Something's got to increase because we have conservation of energy. Right before it hits the ground, the kinetic energy is going to be 1/2 mv squared. And so that is our maximum kinetic energy. I forgot to write it by the KE, so I'll just make a little note that that's the max. So our height is essentially going to turn into velocity for the most part. I won't say for everybody's apparatus. So in a perfect world, our maximum, excuse me, or our initial potential energy is going to equal our final kinetic energy. That I said in a perfect world, and that's our conservation of energy law. And we didn't do specific calculations with energy losses, but we talked about them. And so I'm going to also talk about it today and hope you will talk about it in your report. So in a perfect world, our potential energy would turn into kinetic and we would have no loss in energy. But most of you, or many of you, are building things to actually cut this velocity down and make it a little smaller than it should be. You can imagine if you took a rock and dropped it off a parking deck, it would probably reach a higher speed at the bottom than your egg drop apparatus. And that's part of your design. So how do we talk about that then? How can we discuss conservation of energy? Well, you can tell me that it's supposed to happen. We're supposed to get PE equals KE, but perhaps you spent some time doing a little alteration. So in real life, energy losses will mean that the KE is smaller than it should be. What are the energy losses that we have to deal with, or in this case, that we want to deal with? One of those energy losses is a parachute. Anything that is creating resistance or friction is going to be a loss of energy. So that's the thing I'd like you to discuss that's specific to your apparatus. If you have a large surface area, if you think that your apparatus reached terminal velocity, that is a sign that energy losses kept your energy from being conserved. So don't tell me in the report that your potential energy turned into kinetic energy and that the two are equal when you had a big parachute on there. So in real life, energy losses like air resistance or friction, I'll just make a little note here. The friction from the air is going to mean that our kinetic energy is smaller, and that in turn means that our velocity is smaller. The last thing I'd like you to talk about is where all that kinetic energy goes once it has an impact. So once this hits the ground, where did all the energy go? If it had 100 joules or 200 joules or 1,000 joules of energy, where did that end up going to once it impacted the ground? Did you hear it hit the ground? And I can assure you that you will hear it hit the ground. It goes towards sound, and it creates heat. The motion, that crashing into the ground, creates, we're going to talk about heat next semester, but it creates heat in the energy of the kinetic energy of the molecules, both in the apparatus, the egg when it impacts the ground, and the ground itself. So sound and heat are two big losses of energy. Anytime you hear something hit, that's a little loss of energy because you're vibrating the molecules in the air around it. So those are two good answers for where the energy goes once it hits the ground. All right, I think that is it. I'll finish just by saying that if you like to include photos or you want to include a diagram that you've drawn of your apparatus, I mentioned that here on your sheet, that you can use equations to calculate. Some people get really hung up and want to fill their report with equations. I'd rather honestly have a report full of great explanations in sentence form. Don't try to minimize what you're writing by including more pictures or more drawings. But I certainly don't have any problem with you adding in images that you've taken or drawing, sketching stuff out to point out certain design elements. That works fine with me. All right, I hope it was helpful. You guys enjoy your final building days and enjoy your egg drop writing process, and certainly reach out to me if you have any questions. Bye.